G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the Minor Prophets. Today it is the book of Micah, where we're finishing it off. Thank you for coming along. So welcome to this session of the Minor Prophets. This is the last session for the book of Micah, and we're looking at Micah chapter 6, verse 1 to Micah 7, verse 20. Just casting our mind back on Micah. Micah is dealing with the main things he's dealing with is that God will punish both Israel and Judah for their sins. And also he deals with the fact that the Jewish leaders are the ones who lead the nations astray. He also deals with a surviving remnant, which is where we are in this session, and Israel's redemption and a revival or survival will come by way of the Messiah. And chapter 4 and 5, which was the last session, dealt with the consolation of Israel and the messianic, the three lines of messianism. We see that there is going to be a tribulation before restoration. All nations are going to gather against Jerusalem for the purpose of wiping out the Jews. This is in the last session. But we see that God's intent is actually to destroy them. The Antichrist and his armies suffer great losses at the hands of the Jews, but Israel will eventually fall simply because of the overwhelming numbers of the Antichrist and his armies. But there comes a deliverer. He comes out of a little place called Bethlehem Ephrathah. He's born in Bethlehem, which shows that he's of human origin, and he comes to fulfill God's purpose, and that is to be a ruler in Israel. He comes to be the messianic king. He shall also be of divine origin, because it says that his goings are from everlasting. So he pre-existed. So this is the messianic person, the God-man, and this is the one who will be a deliverer for the nation of Israel. Now, Micah tells us that he's initially rejected by the Jewish leaders, but there will come a time in the future, after they've gone through travail of the tribulation, then there will come a time when there'll be a national new birth, a national regeneration, and the nation will be born the entire nation will be born in one day. With Messiah's return, and because they have to call for him to return, with Messiah's return, we then see that a standard is raised against the Antichrist, and he and his armies are destroyed in the campaign of Armageddon. The Jews will then be united into one nation, and the Messiah will rule over them and defend them from their enemies. The Gentiles who survived tribulation will be judged according to how they treated the Jews during this tribulation period. And the Gentile nations who actually make it into the kingdom will then submit to Israel's spiritual leadership. And this is where we're up to tonight. So this is section 3 of the book of Micah, and this is God's controversy with Israel. This is Micah's third prophetic discourse, and each one of them begins in the same way. Hear ye. This is God's controversy with Israel. And unlike the first and second discourses, which were primarily a straight presentation, except for a bit of dialogue carried on for 2 verses in chapter 2, verse 6 and 7. In chapter 6 and 7, the whole thing is set up as a dialogue with different speakers. And as we go along, I'll point out who's actually speaking. So in chapter 6, verses 1 to 16, we see the controversy of Jehovah. And in the first 2 verses of chapter 6, we have a call to judgment. Now the speaker here is Micah. He's the one speaking. Hear ye now what Jehovah saith. Arise, contend thou before the mountains, and let the hills hear thy voice. Hear, O ye mountains, Jehovah's controversy, and ye enduring foundations of the earth. For Jehovah hath a controversy with his people, and he will contend with Israel. So Micah is speaking, and he calls upon the mountains to gather together to judge this case. It's like a courtroom scene with God being the plaintiff and Israel being the defendant. And the word contend here, where it says he'll contend with Israel, means God's going to plead a case in the legal sense against Israel. So Micah is here calling the court to session. The mountains are to serve as the witnesses, and God's complaint is that Israel has repaid God's love with apostasy. So as he calls the court to session, he calls the people in as the defendant, and he calls the mountains as the witness and the jury. Mountains are enduring and immutable, and therefore they have been eyewitnesses since the beginning. And in fact, in a covenant book between God and Israel, the book of Deuteronomy, Moses stresses the concept of the mountains serving as witnesses of the covenant agreement. And you can see that in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 26, and Deuteronomy 30, verse 19, and 31, verse 28. Isaiah chapter 1, verse 2, Micah's contemporary, also pictured a court scene in a similar way, with the mountains serving as the prosecuting witness. Now, while Israel is a defendant and God's case is against Israel because of Israel's apostasy and sin, nevertheless, notice that he still refers to them as my people, because Israel, the Jews, are always God's people, even when they are in deep apostasy and sin. Positionally, they will always be God's people. And now in verses 3 to 5, we have the challenges of Jehovah's case. And this time, God, Jehovah, is doing the speaking. O my people, what have I done unto thee? And wherein have I wearied thee? Testify against me, for I brought thee up out of the land of Egypt and redeemed thee out of the house of bondage. And I sent before thee Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. O my people, remember now what Balak, king of Moab, devised, and what Balaam, the son of Beor, answered him. Remember from Shittim unto Gilgal, that you may know the righteous acts of Jehovah. So God is speaking to present his case. And in verse 3, he challenges Israel to testify against him and point to any failure on God's part. What has God done to Israel to cause Israel to turn to apostasy? That's what he's asking. How has he wearied Israel for Israel to react this way? What's he done to Israel? And he gives Israel a chance to plead any negativism against God if they have any. And in fact, Isaiah does the same thing in Isaiah 5, verses 3 to 4, and Isaiah 43, verses 22 to 24. But the truth is that Israel cannot say anything or point to anything by way of failure on God's part. The promises which were unconditional were fulfilled. And those promises which were conditional and weren't fulfilled, that was Israel's fault. It was not God's fault. And in verses 4 and 5, he summarizes his grace towards Israel. First up, we see that he redeemed them from slavery. He reminds them of the Exodus experience. He brought them away from Egypt and from enslavement. Secondly, in verse 4, he gave them spiritual leaders such as Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. He gave them Moses, who was a prophet and represented God to the people. He gave them Aaron, who was a priest and represented the people to God. And he gave them Miriam, who became a spiritual teacher of women, who taught them to praise the Lord in song and dance after the crossing of the Red Sea. And then in verse 5, he reminds them of the Balaam incident. Although 4 different times Balaam tried to curse the Jews, God would not allow that to happen. Every time he opened his mouth to curse the Jews, he ended up blessing them instead. And then God reminded them of his grace from Shittim to Gilgal. Shittim was the last place Israel encamped prior to crossing the Jordan River. And that's where they committed the idolatrous sin of Baal Peor. That was whoredom with the Moabite women and worshiping Baal. Now, while God judged Israel and thousands were killed as a result, yet God chose not to wipe out the entire nation. Gilgal, that was the first place Israel encamped on the other side of the Jordan River after crossing into the promised land. And because they failed to practice circumcision during the 40 years of the wilderness wanderings, they were all circumcised in Gilgal. That was inside enemy territory. Now, because it was adult circumcision, they were weakened, and the Canaanites could have come and attacked them, and they would have been at the Canaanites' mercy. But God protected them all the days when they were in their weakened stage after the circumcision. So not only do they have nothing which they can raise up as to where God has failed, God has showed them in these 4 ways how often he has extended his grace and protection to them. Now we see the response of the people in verses 6 to 7. Wherewith shall I come before Jehovah and bow myself before the high God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will Jehovah be pleased with thousands of rams or with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body, for the sin of my soul? So here, as the people are speaking, and on their part, there is finally an admission of guilt. And they bid very high for forgiveness here. But everything they're offering for forgiveness is mere externalism. It is an admission of ignorance as to how to obtain God's blessings. So they offer thousands and 10,000s of sacrifices. But for them, the issue here is quantity. They're offering a lot of sacrifices. But God, for God, the issue is not quantity, it is quality. In fact, they even offer their firstborn. They were trying perhaps to sacrifice a son like Abraham was willing to do, but in actual fact, no sacrifice by itself would be adequate, even to the offering up of sons as with Abraham. Why? Because God demands internal conformity as well as external conformity. External conformity by itself, which is simply the offering of sacrifices, it's useless unless the external conformity is a reflection of internal conformity. It will be unacceptable. So the people a bit high for forgiveness, but all their offerings are these external measures, nothing internal, nothing that comes from the heart. And then we have the reply in verse 8 to the response. And this is God's answer through the prophet who now speaks and tells them what Jehovah requires of them. This is Micah speaking. He has showed thee, O man, what is good. And what doth Jehovah require of thee? But to do justly and to love kindness and to walk humbly with thy God. So the prophet Micah is speaking and he's reminding Israel that God has already revealed what he requires. What he does not require is sacrifice and iniquity. What he does require is sacrifice and faith. These things are not in place of sacrifice because, remember, this is a time of the Mosaic law, and the Mosaic law clearly mandated sacrifices. But again, the Mosaic law didn't merely demand external righteousness, it demanded an internal righteousness as well. And the mere act of sacrificing by itself would never avail apart from being in evidence of faith. Had to have faith. And the same point is made in Psalm 50, verses 7 to 23, and Isaiah chapter 1, verses 10 to 17. So what does God require? God requires three things: but to do justly, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with thy God. To do justly means to establish justice. In Micah's day, the standard of justice, the norm for justice, was the law of Moses. That was the standard, Mosaic law. Now, if this was kept, it would guarantee the keeping of the second and third requirement. So if you kept the Mosaic law, then what would happen would be you would love kindness, because God requires loving kindness. And this refers to acts of mercy. And this is the horizontal relationship, the man-to-man side of things. And this is where you would show how you love your neighbor as yourself, which is comes out of Leviticus 19, verse 18. And the third thing we see here was that is to walk humbly with God. And that is the relationship towards God. It's the Godward side of things. It's the vertical relationship. And this is how to show the love of God. It is fellowship with God and to walk in purity in his ways. If justice is established based upon the law, the Mosaic law, the commandment of the law controlled either one's relationship to God or one's relationship to man. And that's what God requires. And these are all internal elements. If these internal elements were kept, then sacrifices are acceptable as an atonement for sin, but not until then. Sacrifices had to come with faith. And in verses 9 to 16, we have the results of Israel's failures. We'll read verses 9 to 12 here. The voice of Jehovah crieth unto the city, and the man of wisdom will see thy name. Hear ye the rod, and who hath appointed it? Are there yet treasures of wickedness in the house of the wicked, and a scant measure that is abominable? Shall I be pure with wicked balances, and with a bag of deceitful weights? For the rich men thereof are full of violence, and the inhabitants thereof have spoken lies, and their tongue is deceitful in their mouth. So Jehovah again is speaking here. And in verses 9 to 16, he points out that they failed in the three requirements of verse 8. And he spells out the results of Israel's failure. In verse 9, he begins with a declaration of judgment against Jerusalem. Hear ye the rod. Now, the rod is a symbol of judgment, and it's also used by Micah's contemporary, Isaiah. Because in Isaiah chapter 10, verses 5 to 6 and verse 24, he pictures the Assyrians, the Assyrian Empire, as the rod of God's anger against Israel. In verses 10 to 12, he gives two reasons for that judgment. The first one we see in verses 10 and 11. There is the failure to establish justice, to keep the law. The clear evidence of their failure to establish justice and keep the law is the use of false balances. It says wicked balances and with a bag of deceitful weights. So they're using false balances, and often the use of false balances is used to illustrate failure in keeping justice. They're crooks. And two examples from the law, Leviticus 19, 35 to 36, and Deuteronomy 25, 13 to 16. The use of false balances showed that they failed in the first thing that God required, and that was to do justly, to do what was right. But using false balances and false weights was not doing what was right. And then the second thing, in verse 12, they also failed in the area of kindness. They failed to show acts of mercy, and he shows the social injustice He says the rich men are full of violence, and the inhabitants are characterized by lying and deceit. So here we see that they are social injustices, and they fail in the second area of verse 8, and that was they fail to love kindness. Now, before he shows where they fail in the third area, in verses 13 to 15, he returns to the judgment and he describes here the nature of the judgment. Verse 13. Therefore, I also have smitten thee with a grievous wound. I have made thee desolate because of thy sins. Thou shalt eat, but not be satisfied, and thy humiliation shall be in the midst of thee. And thou shalt put away, but thou shalt not save. And that which thou savest will I give up to the sword. Thou shalt sow, but shalt not reap. Thou shalt tread the olives, but shalt not anoint thee with oil, and the vintage, but shalt not drink the wine. So it's going to bring about desolation in verse 13 because of sin. It's going to produce hunger and starvation in verse 14. And the land is going to be characterized by the inability to produce. Productivity would be its characteristic in verse 15. They're going to sow, but there'll be nothing to reap. In verse 16, he provides another reason for the judgment. And here we see the failure in the third area of verse 8. And that is the failure to walk humbly with thy God. In verse 16, it reads, for the statutes of Omri are kept, and all the works of the house of Ahab. And you walk in their counsels, that I may make thee a desolation, and the inhabitants thereof a hissing. And you shall bear the reproach of my people. So how did they fail? First, he says here that the statutes of Omri are kept. Now, who's Omri? Well, Omri was a king. And Omri began a new dynasty in the northern kingdom of Israel, and he persisted in the worship of the golden calf. Omri was the worst up to his time. The details are in 1 Kings 16:25 to 26. It says that Omri did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and did more evil than all who were before him. For he walked in all the way of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, and in the sins that he made Israel to sin, provoking the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger by their idols. So while Omri pushed for the worship of the golden calf was actually a corruption of the true Jehovah worship. They were simply worshiping Jehovah via the golden calf. It saved them having to go down to Jerusalem. But his son Ahab, who came along, he took over the throne after him. He was even worse. With Ahab, it wasn't merely the corruption of the true worship of God through the golden calf, it was the worship of a foreign god. Because remember, Ahab married a woman called Jezebel, a Phoenician, and Jezebel brought in the worship of the god Baal. And their enslavement to the golden calf and Baal shows that they failed to walk humbly with the true God. And this is going to result in desolation. And with all of this, God still refers to them in verse 16 as my people. Because positionally speaking, the Jews are always God's people, even when they are guilty of gross sin. And we're going to see the judgment in force in chapter 7, verses 1 to 6. This is the last chapter of Micah. Here the prophet is speaking for the faithful remnant. Woe is me, for I am as when they have gathered the summer fruits, as the grape gleanings of the vintage. There is no cluster to eat. My soul desires the first ripe fig. The godly man is perished out of the earth, and there is none upright among men. They all lie in wait for blood. They hunt every man his brother with a net. Their hands are upon that which is evil to do it diligently. The prince asks, and the judge is ready for reward. And the great man, he uttereth the evil desire of his soul. Thus they weave it together. The best of them is as a briar. The most upright is worse than a thorn hedge. The day of thy watchman, even thy visitation, is come. Now shall be their perplexity. In this vision, the prophet pictures himself in a rather unique condition on the earth. Micah is speaking, but he's speaking on behalf of the faithful remnant living in the tribulation. Verse 1 opens up with a lament. Woe is me. He says, I feel like I'm in a field looking for fruit, but all the fruit has already been collected. He's like the first ripe fig, and the first ripe fig is quickly picked and eaten. The first ripe fig was actually a delicacy. It was a special delicacy. In Isaiah 28, verse 4, we see that. And it was always, the first ripe fig was always quick to be snatched. Hosea chapter 9, verse 10 also pictured Israel as the first ripe fig. But now this too is gone. And the reason for Micah's lamentation is in verse 1. It's spelled out in verse 2. He says, the godly man is perished out of the earth, and there is none upright among men. So the reason for Micah's lamentation is this. Several times is that all the godly men are gone. Now, several times in the Old Testament, when it speaks of a prophetic future, it talks about a specific point of time when there is simply not a single righteous one upon the earth, which would imply a contradiction that God always has a believing remnant. But in the New Testament, there will be only one small point in prophetic history that there will be none righteous on the earth, and that, of course, is right after the rapture of the church. At that moment, not a single righteous one is left on the earth. The rapture is strictly a New Testament doctrine. It's not found in the Old Testament, but the Old Testament only hints at it by speaking of a time when there's going to be, for a duration, not a single righteous one left on the earth. They're all gone, and there's no one member of the remnant around at that moment. And here is one such example when he looks around and there's not a single righteous person left. Other examples are in Psalm 12, verse 1, Psalm 12, verse 1, Psalm 14, verses 2 to 3, Psalm 14, 2 to 3, and Psalm 53, 2 to 3, Psalm 53, 2 to 3. A clearer passage in the Old Testament is Isaiah 57, verses 1 to 2. Again, Isaiah is Micah's contemporary, and Isaiah points out that the righteous have been removed from the evil to come. The evil to come is the tribulation, and the righteous have been removed from the evil to come. But the way they are removed is never spelled out in the Old Testament, only in the New Testament. So the fruits of chapter 7, verse 1 are the righteous ones, the godly of 7, verse 2, and they have all disappeared. So the lament in these verses, this is the lament of a Jew, suddenly seeing himself in a situation where there are no righteous ones. And with New Testament knowledge we have, I would put this, this would be more than likely, it would be a Jew right after the rapture. He's left on the earth because he was not a believer when the rapture took place. And now in verses 2 to 4, he spells out how corrupt the people have become. In verse 2, there was general corruption throughout the nation. In verse 3, there was legal corruption. In fact, civil leaders would ask for a false verdict, and the judges are ready and willing and eager to be bribed. The great men, the rich men, do what they want. All of these people, the civil leaders, the judge, the rich people, they all weave it together. They bind together. They are all in accord in this conspiracy. And then in verse 4, even the most righteous amongst them turns out to be a real rotter of a man, because he's a briar. He's a thorn. And in verse 4, for these reasons, he says, the day of thy watchmen has finally arrived. The watchmen are the true prophets of God. And God refers to the prophets as his watchmen in Isaiah 21, verse 6 and verses 11 to 12. Actually, Ezekiel 33, verse 7 says the same thing. When he says the day of thy watchman has come, the day of visitation has come, the day of visitation is another Old Testament name for the tribulation. The tribulation the prophets warned would come has come. And what the prophets has predicted is here. In verses 5 and 6, in the tribulation, there's a corruption of all relationships. So in verse 5, there's even a distrust of even close relations. Trust ye not in a neighbor, put ye not confidence in a friend. Keep the doors of thy mouth from her that lieth in thy bosom. For the son dishonoreth the father, the daughter rises up against her mother, the daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies are the men of his house, of his own house. So first, what we see here is you can't trust your neighbor. So we see a distrust of even close relations here. You can't trust your neighbor. Secondly, you can't even trust your best friend. But thirdly, you can't even trust your own wife. For he says, she that lies in your bosom. And this refers to secrets a husband might share with a wife during sexual intercourse. But even that can no longer be trusted. And in verse 6, there will be a total disunity of the family. There'll be a total change in the Jewish family structure. While the Jewish family unit historically has been famous for being a very strong family unit, this totally changes. In fact, Jesus himself, the Messiah, prophesied this would take place. And he did that in Matthew chapter 10, verses 34 to 36. And he quotes there this passage of Micah when he says so. Now, in the immediate statement that Jesus made, the division of the family unit is caused by belief in his messiahship. The one thing that causes instantaneous division within the Jewish family unit is when one member becomes a believer in Messiah. No matter how close-knit a Jewish family might be, if one chooses to become a believer, there is instantaneous division. And that will become a severe problem in the tribulation. And in fact, according to Malachi chapter 4, verses 5 to 6, Malachi 4, 5 to 6, one of the reasons why Elijah is coming to restore the Jewish family unit that has broken down and to work with Israel in such a way that the name of Jesus will no longer be a point of division in the Jewish family unit. That's why he's returning. Now we're going to see that there'll be hope during the judgment in verses 7 to 10. Now, as in the earlier segment, the prophet is speaking on behalf now of the faithful remnant in verse 7. But as for me, I will look unto Jehovah. I will wait for the God of my salvation. My God will hear me. Verse 8, rejoice not against me, O mine enemy. When I fall, I shall arise. When I sit in darkness, Jehovah will be a light unto me. So in this hope during the judgment, he expresses two hopes. And these two hopes are interspersed with two messages to the enemy of Israel, especially the enemy of the remnant. The first hope in verse 7, which is the hope of salvation. The faithful remnant will find itself in the midst of the tribulation judgments, but will look to God, knowing that at some point he will move in to bring salvation, both physical and spiritual salvation. And with that first hope expressed, the hope of salvation, in verse 8, we have the first message to the enemy. And the word enemy in the Hebrew text here is, it's a feminine singular, and in Hebrew, a feminine singular is often a feminine singular collective, which means it's one representing the whole. So the message here is not only to one enemy, but it is the entire body of Israel's enemies looked upon as one. And the message to the enemy is not to rejoice when Israel does fall, not to rejoice when Israel moves into this period of darkness, this period of the indignation, the period of the tribulation, because even in that period of darkness, there is going to be light. Why? Because Jehovah will be a light unto me, Micah says. I will bear the indignation of Jehovah because I have sinned against him, verse 9, until he plead my cause and execute judgment for me. He will bring me forth to the light, and I shall behold his righteousness. So the second hope is expressed here in verse 9, and this is a hope of deliverance. I will bear the indignation of Jehovah because I have sinned against him. And the word indignation is another common descriptive in the Old Testament for the tribulation. Now, speaking for the faithful remnant, they now realize they must now go through this period of darkness. They must go through this period of the indignation of Jehovah because Israel has sinned against him. Now, once they have successfully passed through and have turned to him as a nation for salvation, he will then reverse himself and plead Israel's cause. And eventually, God will plead Israel's cause, and then he will execute judgment upon Israel's enemy, the judgment on behalf of Israel instead of against Israel. In verse 9, he also says that he will bring me forth to the light, and I shall behold his righteousness. The ultimate fulfillment of that last phrase will be the second coming, when the Shekinah glory light in the person of the Messiah returns, and the faithful remnant will indeed behold his righteousness. And then verse 10, then mine enemy shall see it, and shame shall cover her who said unto me, where is Jehovah thy God? Mine eyes shall see my desire upon her. Now shall she be trodden down as the mire of the streets. So now he has a second message to Israel's enemy. And in verse 10, the enemy will be ashamed. The enemy that once asked the question, where is Jehovah thy God? That enemy will be destroyed. That enemy will be trodden down. Psalm 79 is a psalm that gives a poetic version to Israel's pleading at the end of the tribulation for the second coming to take place. And in that psalm, the complaint is the same. The Gentile nations have been saying to Israel, where now is your God? And you can see that in Psalm 79, verse 10. With the second coming, the enemy will realize where Israel's God is and who he is, and the enemy will be destroyed. Now we have the promise of restoration in verses 11 to 13 of chapter 7. Here again, Jehovah is speaking, and he speaks in response to the two hopes expressed by the remnant in verses 7 to 10. A day for building thy walls. In that day shall the decree be far removed. In that day shall they come unto thee from Assyria and the cities of Egypt, and from Egypt even to the river, and from sea to sea, and from mountain to mountain. Yet shall the land be desolate because of them that dwell therein, for the fruit of their doings. Now in verse 11, he promises a future restoration when Jerusalem will be rebuilt. There will be a time when the walls will be reconstructed. It will also be a time when the decree will be far removed. Exactly what this decree is was spelled out by Micah's contemporary Isaiah in Isaiah 28, verses 14 to 22. In that Isaiah passage, 28, 14 to 22, when we see Israel signs a covenant with the Antichrist. Now in heaven, God issues a decree of destruction against the whole earth because of what Israel does. It's a decree by which the tribulation judgments are poured out. And when the restoration comes, that same decree will be far removed, and the tribulation judgments will be removed, resulting in her borders being now extended. In verse 12, he pictures the regathering. showing the regathering will take place from two localities, from Egypt and Assyria. Micah's contemporary said the same thing twice. Isaiah 11 verses 15 to 16 and Isaiah 27 verse 13. We also saw it earlier on in Hosea 11:11, and the same point we'll see later in Zechariah 10:10 to 11. And whenever you see the word river with a capital R, it's a reference to the Euphrates River, the great river, the river Euphrates. So the regathering in that day will be from Assyria, Egypt, from sea to sea and mountain to mountain. They all come together. The same point that he made in chapter 4, he makes again here, that in verse 13, prior to that restoration, prior to that regathering here in verse 13, they must first undergo a period of desolation. The Messianic kingdom won't be established until after Israel undergoes the period of the Great Tribulation. Micah, twice, when he talks about the final regathering, the reestablishment, the world peace, the Messianic kingdom, also pointed out that prior to that happening, Israel must suffer the period of tribulation for her sins. So the same thing is what he's saying here in verses 11 to 12. Restoration, but in verse 13, desolation will precede it. Verse 14, here we have the prayer for restoration. And here the people are speaking. Feed thy people with thy rod, the flock of thy heritage, which dwell solitarily in the forest in the midst of Carmel. Let them feed in Bashan and Gilead, as in the days of old. So in response to the promises made in verses 11 to 13, the prayer comes for this restoration. And they ask for the restoration to be total, to include Carmel, which is in the Cisjordan, or it's on the west side of the Jordan, and Gilead, which is in the Transjordan, or the east side of the Jordan, and Bashan, which is north, which is now called the Golan Heights. Now we see the humiliation of the enemy in verses 15 to 17. So in response to that in verses 15 to 17, there is now a promise of humiliation of the enemy. And here again, God is doing the speaking. Verse 15, as in the days of thy coming forth out of the land of Egypt, will I show unto them marvelous things. The nations shall see and be ashamed of all their might. They shall lay their hand upon their mouth, their ears shall be deaf. They shall lick the dust like a serpent, like crawling things of the earth. They shall come trembling out of their close places. They shall come with fear unto Jehovah our God, and shall be afraid because of thee. So here God promises to humiliate the enemy. In verse 15, this will be initially done when God repeats the miracles he did in Egypt. And just as he performed marvelous things during the period of the Exodus, he's going to do that again. In verse 16, as a result, the nations will be ashamed. It says they'll shut their mouths in a state of reverential silence. It's going to be silence caused by shame. Those who once taunted, where is now thy God, will cease that kind of taunting. And then in verse 17, the nations will also fear. They'll lick the dust like a serpent, like crawling things out of the earth. They'll come out trembling because with the return of the Messiah, the Gentiles will now undergo their own judgment, the judgment of the Gentiles, which we find in Joel 3, 1 to 3, and the judgment of the Gentiles in Matthew 25, verses 31 to 46. This is the sheep and goat judgment. Now we see the response of praise in verses 18 to 20. Here the prophet is speaking again. Who is a God like unto thee, that pardoneth iniquity, and passeth over the transgression of the remnant of his heritage? He retaineth not his anger forever, because he delighteth in loving kindness. He will again have compassion upon us. He will tread our iniquities underfoot, and that will cast all their sins into the depths of the sea. Thou wilt perform the truth to Jacob and the loving kindness to Abraham, which thou hast sworn unto our fathers from the days of old. Now Micah concludes the book by speaking himself, and he has a word game with his own name. Remember, Micah means who is like God. And that's what he's saying in verse 18. Who is a God like unto you? In verses 18 to 19, you have the promise of the forgiveness of the sins of the remnant. When he says, who is a God like unto thee? It's also a reflection of the Exodus experience, because after the crossing of the Red Sea in Exodus 15:11, Moses raised the same question. Who is a God like unto thee? And now when the remnant is saved and their sins are forgiven and the people are restored, they too will raise the same question. Who is a God like unto thee? In verses 18, the specific promise is that the remnant of Israel, they spoke about as early as chapter 2, verses 12 to 13. But the end of the tribulation, the remnant of Israel and all Israel is the same. It is their sins which are now going to be forgiven. In verse 19, this will lead to his compassion. In verse 19, he'll again have compassion upon us. He'll tread our iniquity on the foot, and thou wilt cast all their sins into the depths of the sea. Thou wilt perform the truth to Jacob and the loving kindness to Abraham, which thou hast sworn unto our fathers from the days of old. So in verse 19, this will now lead to his compassion. And he will take all the sins of Israel and do two things with them: tread them on the foot and cast them into the sea. Now, in Rosh Hashanah, in the Rosh Hashanah format, there's a ceremony Orthodox Jews do, which is called the Tashlik, which is the sending forth. After the morning service, they go to a body of water, a beach, a lake, or a river, or a stream, and they symbolically empty their pockets of their sins. And that Tashlik service, which is done every year by Orthodox Jews, the Feast of Trumpets, it's based on verse 19 here, which says he will cast all their sins in the depths of the sea. Now, the basis of Israel's national forgiveness is spelled out in verse 20, and it's going to be on the basis of the Abrahamic covenant. Thou wilt perform the truth to Jacob and the loving kindness to Abraham, which thou hast sworn unto our fathers from the days of old. So it's on the basis of the Abrahamic covenant that there's going to be a national salvation of Israel and a national restoration of Israel, because those were contained within the promises of the Abrahamic covenant. Promises which up until now have remained unfulfilled. And every promise that is unfulfilled must ultimately be fulfilled. And the basis of the promises of the Abrahamic covenant is the hope of restoration. And with this hope, the book of Micah is concluded. Thank you for coming along. Study hard and grow strong.